Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar that is being hosted by Plus. First, let me introduce myself. I am Samyem Kize from Afra. This event is a platform for sharing some of the activities and insights from a research project based at Plus entitled The Impacts of COVID-19 Responses on the Political Economy of South African Food Systems. The project is being conducted in Ghana, Tanzania, and South Africa, and is supported by IDRC, which is Canada's International Development Research Center, under its Agriculture and Food Security Program. So today we'll be discussing one part of the South Africa's official COVID response, a special COVID relief fund for small-scale farmers. The webinar is co-hosted with our project partner, which is AFRA, and the civil society network, Learners. So today we look forward to a lively debate and very fruitful participation from everyone, and hoping to hear more from you. If you tweet, please tweet. We are on hashtags that are typed in our comment box. Please use them. Please use the comment box. Please tell us who you are, where you're tuning in from, and as to get the ball rolling, please do post in the comments box either your comments or your questions, either to individuals or to the panel as a whole. Insofar as this format allows, let's keep this active and interactive as possible. As you're aware, government's response was to launch a relief program specifically for small-scale farmers, which provided subsidies for farming inputs. Alongside food parcels and additional social grants, this was how government aimed to address the crisis brought by COVID. In this webinar, we will critically assess government's COVID relief fund for small-scale farmers, which ran from April 2020 last year to early 2021 in the three different phases. Each phase had different rules as to who was eligible and offered different levels and forms of support. There were winners and losers throughout this process. Some farmers were able to access support and sustain production. Others got support, but in ways that didn't help them and have not been able to recover from their losses. Many did not receive any support. Some of the criteria excluded people, including women, on family-owned land and people without formally registered companies and bank accounts. All this brings into question how state authorities think about the huge numbers of people who get their livelihoods from supplying the country with food. So today, we offer not a simple story of policy, but something more profound. It is not merely the pandemic that is changing our food system, but also the way that policy makers, regulators, and food industry actors react and respond. We have 4 speakers today, more than normal, because each speaker brings a specific perspective to the topic. So we'll have 4 distinct angles from which we can understand the COVID relief initiatives, what assumptions underpin these, who benefited, and who was excluded. We will have Laurel Utley from Civil Society and Activist Network. We will have Stembiso, a farmer in KZN. We have Portia, a farmer and a farming community activist in Gauteng. And lastly, we have Ruth Hall, a researcher at PLUS. Today, we'll be doing 2 rounds of inputs from our speakers before engaging on the comments and questions from you all. So first round will be just to identify and see what happened during the COVID. What are the issues that came? What's the implications of COVID? And what was the response that was received from government? And the second round will be where each speaker will be given 1 minute to respond to how they think, through the experiences they've had, what they think might be possible in terms of doing things differently, and what have they learned from the past experiences. So let's get cracking. Our first speaker is Laurel Utley. She's the director of the Association for Rural Advancement, AFRA, which is a land rights advocacy organization based in KwaZulu-Natal. She also represents Landness, the Land Network National Engagement Strategy of South Africa, which is a consultative national civil society platform working towards people-centered land governance. Laurel, I understand that you are part of the Land and Civil Society National Engagement Strategy that engaged government around the 3 phases of the relief grant. Please tell us more about that.
Great. Everyone, thank you for the introduction, Samke. Yes, so as LandNess, as a network, we did indeed engage quite closely with government at certain points in the process to try and add value, not just from a civil society perspective, but from the experiences of farmers on the ground. We joined together with the C19 People's Coalition, which emerged very quickly after the start of the lockdown. And this brought together a really wide range of different kinds of organizations, activists, much wider than we'd ever engaged with before, which brought a lot of different perspectives into our inputs. I think what's been interesting is how much confusion there's been around what are these different phases of these grants, what exactly were they or are they? So it might be helpful for me just to start by mapping out a little bit what exactly unfolded. So what we saw was that the first phase of what was called the COVID-19 Agricultural Disaster Support Fund for smallholder and communal farmers, it's a mouthful. This was led by the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. And it emerged very quickly after the start of lockdown and was announced on the 6th of April, but with a very short time frame for implementation by the 22nd. So this is what is generally called the first phase of input support. And the budget was taken from the land reform budget. It was a budget of 1.2 billion that they expected to spend in this first phase. And of course, the impacts of that money coming from land reform are significant. I won't speak to that yet. Phase 2, or what many people think of as phase 2, was called the Farming Input Voucher Project. And this was run by the Solidarity Fund in partnership with the Food and Agriculture Agency of the United Nations, the FAO, and the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development as an advisory body. So this only started in October 2020, so much later, after that first round had already been closed and completed, and it's still running to today. It was supposed to have finished by December last year, but as with all of these grants, the timeframes for implementation were significantly longer than were anticipated, which had a lot of unfortunate knock-on effects. But it really shows the lack of understanding when these processes were designed in terms of what it actually takes to get inputs to farmers on the ground during the times of COVID. What most people consider to be phase 3 is the Presidential Employment Stimulus Initiative for Subsistence Farmers, better known as PESI. This is the most well-known of the grants. It was also run by the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development. And this was implemented by the provincial level department, which had a district director and a task team, and was rolled out by NARISEC youth and unemployment agricultural graduates. So these are the 3 phases. They're very distinct. Each of them had different criteria, different processes of application or selection, different kind of commodities and beneficiaries being targeted. And what's also interesting, and just to mention that some of the improvements that we saw in phase 2 and phase 3 came about directly from the inputs that civil society made very quickly at the beginning of the process. And for us, that's significant because it's not that often that civil society's inputs are taken on board and the experiences of farmers. Of course, they also improved because of the department's own experience on the ground. But we really want to emphasize that the very concrete inputs from civil society did have some very positive consequences. I'd love to take you through all the detail of the differences between the grants. I don't have time today to go into too much detail. So I just want to highlight a couple of quick things. So the first is that the first phase targeted smallholder and communal producers with an annual turnover of between 20,000 and $1 million per annum. That falls into a very specific category or understanding of smallholder and communal producers that can be found in the department's policies. The Solidarity Fund, on the other hand, targeted household food production, and the PESI grant focused on subsistence farmers. Again, what a subsistence farmer means is interpreted differently by different people. So the first one started in April, as I said, the second in October, and the third was open for applications in December. The last two are still currently running. Verification visits and voucher redemptions are still happening. One thing maybe to quickly highlight was that all three of these provided farming input vouchers, which were electronic vouchers and could be redeemed at input suppliers. The first was vouchers up to 50,000 Rand. The second Solidarity Fund was 2,000 Rand for everyone across the board, regardless of circumstances. And the third phase was between 1,000 and 9,000, depending on the commodity type and particular production scales. So you can see a huge difference from the much larger grant in the first phase targeting, those with a higher turnover, a small voucher for household food production, and slightly larger for smallholder farmers. The impact of how these needed to be redeemed at input suppliers was that when there were very strict criteria of what, okay, I'm over time. Okay, I'll wrap up just to say that the kinds of inputs that were made by the civil society groups was really to improve the application process, being slightly more inclusive, not as inclusive as we would like, of a broader criteria for farmers, and better, a wider range of commodities and households that could be supported. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurel, for sharing such detailed information. I'm quite fascinated by how government engaged civil societies around supporting communities. This was a very significant initiative from the government side. Thank you. My next speaker is Stembiso Ndlovu, who is from KZN and is based in Pietermaritzburg. The 25-year-old is a small-scale farmer who was retrenched as a forklift driver at the start of the lockdown. So, what was your experience of COVID? The impact of COVID, the support you needed, and the application process? Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot, Samge, for tuning me in. I was working as a forklift driver, and I'm one of those people who've got retrenched when the COVID-19 is approaching the global. On that time, I was forced to go to home and quarantine. And then on that time, I tried to get an opportunity to rely on my business that I started with my own capital as a forklift driver. But on that time, there was a problem because I didn't able to go and buy the feed and the vaccine on the right time. The reason why is because the policies and the soldiers were all over doing roadblocks and asking for the permit. If you don't have it, then you've got arrested for that. Then and that permit I didn't get it from the police station. They said they are out of stock. So my chickens on that time were starting going hungry because of no feed and no vaccine. Some of them, they are dying because of not getting a vaccine at the right time. And then it's where I started to sell them out. Then I heard about the COVID-19 grant, and I applied for it. It was April, if I'm not mistaken. I requested the layer cages and the feed and the vaccine also. and lay hands. Even though it was kind of difficult to fill up the form from the department, because I went to the department office that is nearest with me here in Pietermaritzburg. I requested for the form. Then when I'm filling up the form, it was kind of difficult because they requested some documents that you need to attach, like invoices. You have to put 3 months bank statements, so most of the small scale farmers, they are not registered, and some of them they don't keep some invoices when they buy feed or vaccine. So then on October, I receive a call from the department. It's whereby they give me a feedback about my application for COVID-19. It's where I receive an amount of 30,000, and I use it to buy the feed and the vaccine and the layers also. But I didn't able to buy the cages according to their strict terms and conditions. But the department really helped me a lot, and I really appreciated their funding. Thanks a lot, Samge.
Thank you so much, Ste. It's very interesting to hear that government was able to support you, but also it's quite interesting to hear that as much as government did support you, but it wasn't that kind of support that you really required, because I hear you mentioned that you requested for a layer cager, but you couldn't receive that, as well as you just sharing some of the experiences and the difficulties that you went through while applying, and how other farmers couldn't benefit from the same support just because they didn't have such documents like the bank statements. It's quite an interesting experience. Thank you so much for sharing that. Our next speaker is Portia Mahlobo, who is the founder of the Itamba project and Grow Mama. Her life's work is centered around leaving a legacy for her daughter. She's passionate about supporting mothers, food sovereignty, and human dignity. So, Portia, I understand that you've been helping other women and people. Can you tell us, in your experience, how COVID impacted on them? Over to you, Portia. And please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Portia Mahlobo, and I'm the founder of Itamba Projects and Grow Mama Gardens. We started our initiative in the just after lockdown, and it was actually inspired by us trying to assist women and children who were going without their daily needs. We had quite a very busy year last year of 2020. We initially started off just trying to meet the needs of communities, but it became evident to us that we needed to work on solutions that are more sustainable. And it was critical for us to actually have the communities we serve be part of their own solutions. This only pointed us in one direction, because we would assist women perhaps with a food parcel, and there'd be a long time in between the next drop-off. So we decided, let us begin to actually educate ourselves and get into the agricultural sector and begin to do our own planting. It grew from there. And as we were increasing the project, more communities started to tag along. And then as we assessed the needs of the communities, we saw that we needed training and we needed inputs. And that's when we then applied for both the PESI as well as the smaller family producer vouchers. We did quite a lot of work, and we really saw the benefits of the voucher systems, but we encountered quite a lot of challenges. As I said, that we work predominantly with women and with mothers of young children. So accessibility, transportation, those were the things that we struggled with the most. With the voucher system, our challenges became that there was some systems, some things that were inconsistent. For instance, looking at the PESI voucher system, the application was not as easy as it could. The Solidarity Fund small producer voucher was. So a lot of the people that we work with struggled with that. And then secondly, there was inconsistencies with who gets the voucher and who doesn't. We'd get a producer who's been in farming, maybe they're a subsistence farmer, but they had a project going, they did get a visit. However, they would not get the funding, and then we'd get somebody in Van der Bijl who would had a seedling propagation business, and they've just started it their first month, and then they receive a voucher for 9,000 Rand. We had quite a few challenges, but we've been able to overcome them by understanding both ourselves and the system that we've been working with. And the reason why we moved from food parcels to where we are now, to training communities to be able to run sustainable businesses, is because we saw that there's a big gap in the market for organic production. There's so much that communities can assimilate themselves. And we saw that there's a big shift going from mass production by few to a production to the masses taking over production and becoming part of the agricultural sector. We had quite a lot of support from the C19 People's Coalition Fund, especially starting off with the food parcels. They really believed in us, information, networking, and that's how we're able to get where we are today.
For sharing, Portia. Just to remind our viewers, if you're watching us on either YouTube or Facebook, please tell us where you are watching us from, and please do share that also in our comments box. So just share who you are, where you're from, even if it's YouTube or Facebook. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce our last speaker. This is Ruth Hall, who is a researcher and a professor at PLUS, where she holds the Saatchi Chair in Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies. She's leading our 3-country study on COVID and African food systems in Ghana, Tanzania, and in South Africa, supported by IDRC. Ruth, please tell us more about the research findings from Limpopo Research. Over to you, Lu.
Thanks, Samke. So I'll be reporting on actually quite preliminary findings from research that we've conducted in one province, that is Limpopo province. And this is part of tracking back how changes in markets, particularly in Gauteng, during the lockdown, had a ripple effect in terms of the very large number of small-scale farmers in Limpopo who supply those markets. So we spent a few weeks conducting field work earlier this year, and I'll be sharing some of those findings. I want to also acknowledge a team of PLUS students, including Connie Mochale and Ashley Fishoff, who contributed particularly to some parts of this, but also others. So I want to tell the story in 3 parts. The first is talking to the officials who governed or managed the system, implemented it. Secondly, to the small-scale farmers, particularly groups of women working in cooperatives. And thirdly, the story as we found it by talking with managers at the input supply companies where people had to go and redeem their vouchers. So let's start with the government. What became clear from talking with senior officials, including the acting chief director of the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, is that in fact, just the sheer scale of at least the first phase of the relief fund, which was more substantial, was very small. Across the whole province, they had dispersed around 2,500 vouchers. That's sitting at something like 1% of the total number of estimated small-scale producers in the province. So it's clearly a small subset. Within that, it became clear that, perhaps quite surprisingly, between women and men, they were almost equal in terms of who got. And in fact, women, there were slightly more women who got support than men. But this actually obscures the reality of a gender bias within the system that I'll describe in a moment. One of the things that they did to promote it was to advertise through media channels, but also through the farmers' associations, NAFU and AFASA, primarily Black emerging commercial farmers, mostly men, and then the older commercial farming unions, including Agri South Africa. And what they did, actually, as Laurel said, is that they redirected the Land Reform Fund into this purpose. One of the results is that they did not buy a single farm for land redistribution in the province in 2020. So this COVID relief came at a direct cost of land reform. The second phase in the province was actually funded by new money from the provincial treasury. When we went off and spoke with groups of small-scale farmers around different parts in two districts of the provinces, some people had received this and had found the application process difficult, but had managed to get through. But quite a few, particularly cooperatives of women farmers, had not heard of this, despite having some contact with government. In one village outside Mopani, it became clear that most had never heard either of this departmental process or of the Solidarity Fund. But a lot of them had lost the access to markets. One of the things, of course, that was an irony is that a lot of the agricultural support over time has been pushing people to produce commercial crops for faraway markets. So those sending crops like mustard, chilies, okra, and baby marrows through to Johannesburg, to City Deep or Joburg Fresh Produce Market, found that there was no local market for them. So when they did manage to send their produce, they didn't get any income, and the transporters were shifting the costs back onto the producers. So that was a huge risk. So it wasn't just a matter of access. What became apparent is, firstly, many people didn't know about this. Very few people got it, and those that did were particularly those who were better connected to start with. We then interviewed in some detail some of the managers of the input supply companies. Now, this was fascinating because, for instance, one company which is very important there is NTK, it's the Noord-Transvaal Coöperasie, so part of the VKB group. These are the old cooperatives that were set up by the apartheid government to support white commercial agriculture. And they're now privatized, and they're big supply companies. Now, government took this big bucket of money that had been allocated to the relief fund and allocated it unevenly across a small number, I think it's less than 10, of these companies. NTK got 30 million, Senvis, dealing with the grain sector, got 20 million, AgriCorp, Obaro, Afgri, and TWK. So government, through a process that, as far as we can make out, was totally untransparent, decided to allocate large amounts of the public money to these private corporations through the voucher system. So the vouchers would be allocated to small farmers, but you had to spend it at that company. The response from managers, one in particular said, what happened because of COVID? I benefited. Sales went up because government pumped this money into the industry. Of course, some of these companies also lost markets, particularly the regional markets. So those farmers from Mozambique and Zimbabwe who would normally buy from them, they lost that because of border closures. But the bump up in public money through the small-scale voucher system more than compensated for that. We also managed to get details by taking photos of large volumes of these vouchers, thanks to my students, and to analyze the ID numbers and to understand who got. And what's really interesting here is that it was mostly younger men who received support. But the second most significant category was older people, particularly older women. And here there's an interesting thing, which is that most of the women who were getting support as groups, as cooperatives. So in fact, like one cooperative of 11 women would get the same kind of level of support as a single man. So the push towards supporting cooperatives to access markets has had a negative effect in terms of how much support they could get. So I'll come back to some suggestions for what could be done better in the future in our next round. Thanks, Samke.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Quite interesting and informative experiences we're hearing. what I'm picking up is that as much as government extended their support to the grassroots level, there's still those farmers who are left behind. I'm also hearing that government worked with civil societies in order to reach out to these communities using land reform budgets. The research that you just shared, Ruth, is striking as you sharing that informal producers experience some challenges, while the commercial farmers didn't experience at all those challenges at all. In fact, they saying it that they benefited because of COVID. It's quite striking. That's all I can say. So let's move on to our round two. This round, we will share more in terms of what we've learned. Each speaker will be given maximum of 2 minutes. You'll share what you've learned, what could be done differently, and maybe what are the outcomes or implications of the experiences that you've gone through. I'd like to first start with Laurel. Over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Samke. And maybe I can also just encourage those who are tuning in. I can see the lovely array of people from different parts of the country. Just to also share your comments and questions in the chat box so we can respond to them. We'd love you to be part of the discussion. So what we learned as civil society, firstly, is that NGO mobilization and inputs into both the criteria and the process does make a difference, even if it's very limited. So that was the first lesson we learned. It's worth it, but you have to make very specific and concrete inputs to really make that change. I think that we saw that that both in Solidarity Fund and in the PESI voucher, but also that the focus on using current government systems without understanding what's really happening on the ground, without having a proper database or any database of small producers who could have been directly informed and verified, as Ruth spoke to, meant that many were just excluded. I do think that also the realization that, particularly in the first round, you spoke about NGOs being in the field. Those of us who were able to get people in the field, working with farmers, had a very high success rate compared to the rest of applicants. But civil society capacity is limited and shrinking as funding shrinks. So there's a real concern that the needs and realities of small producers are more and more being left out of the system. Just to quickly touch on what could be done better, I think the first is, these were once off little small grants to respond to a crisis, but there's no guarantee of continued support. So how are farmers supposed to continue farming when they remain in extremely difficult circumstances with the financial crisis? Also, just really that government needs to assess the implications of their implementation strategies before they dive in. So they're rushing to respond to need, which is positive, but then they're doing it without thinking it through or consulting, which results in huge challenges for farmers and huge exclusions. Massive amounts of categories of farmers simply left out by all three of these rounds of support. Thank you.
I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Tembiso. Can you please share your insights as well and learnings from your experiences? Thank you.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Samge, again for tuning me in. First of all I can say is the COVID-19 relief fund is just helped me a lot on my business, because it's back up my business, because I lost everything. But Samge, I didn't get what I requested, because I requested the cages and the layers and the layer mesh and the vaccine also. But the department said you can't buy the cages, but only to find out that the amount that they give it to me is enough to buy the cages. But they said you can't buy the cages. And then I asked them that I can decrease the number of the hens, because the hens, they need the protection since I'm using the cage system. But they said no, you can't. Then I said okay, it's fine. Then I'm forced to doing that. That is why you find out that most of the farmers they are selling their vouchers because they don't get what they requested, only to find out the department, the thing that they cancel is the thing that we need the most as farmers, but they just cancel it. I don't know why, but I really wish that they can fix that matters next time when they decided to give us something and help us to grow. Another thing that we have is the feed. The price of the feed is too much high if you're going to buy it in factories, but it's getting worse if you find out that you are a funded small farmers. You're using a voucher. If you're using a voucher, they triple the prices, and I don't know why they make more prices when you've got the vouchers, and that's the problem we're facing. And we really wish to know that why they times the money when you're buying your needs with the voucher that you're getting from the department. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tay. So much learnings that are coming through, and just as Laurel shared earlier, it's just coming up that government needs to do more groundwork engagements to avoid exclusion of farmers who are being supported. Thank you so much for sharing. Over to you, Portia.
One of my takeaways from what we've seen during COVID-19 is this. We need the government, or in fact different stakeholders, to invest more in training. Because when we look at the communities we work with, one of the biggest lack usually is it's either finances, input, and skills. So I would love for the next round, or if there's other interventions such as the previous one, that they include training, include skills development, and actually even look at peer-to-peer mentorship among the farmers. Because there's a lovely saying that I always that I came across some time back that says, if you want a year's prosperity, plant grain. But if you want 10 years of prosperity, plant a tree. But if you invest, if you want 100 years of prosperity, invest your time at growing human beings. So we need to make sure that more skills development is looked at. And the other thing for me would be that we need integrated approaches that unifies both civil society as well as government, as well as organized agriculture. I believe they were the commercial farmers, the developing farmers, the emerging farmers. They were the picture that the piece of the puzzle that was not evident or not seen throughout this picture.
Portia, for their input. We're really getting some insightful ways that we could advocate more and maybe do even much better in terms of how we engage government in these strategies that they come up with. Because I think we need to be more, it just shows that we need to be more on the ground, participate with those grassroots individuals who are affected by these circumstances. Thank you, Portia, for that. Can we move to our last speaker, Ruth? Can you please share your learnings and maybe propose a way forward? Thank you.
Thanks, Samke. Well, I think that the way in which this COVID relief for small-scale farmers was designed and how it was adapted over time actually tells us a lot about how government understands farming and the food system. And I think that a lot of those assumptions are flawed. Clearly, government seems to think that a small-scale farmer is a single thing and that one can have a standard approach. There's several fundamental problems that we should learn from. Firstly, the vouchers were designed in a highly restrictive manner. They weren't transferable. You couldn't choose where to redeem them. In fact, you couldn't choose what to redeem them on. So bureaucrats were making decisions about what inputs farmers should get. they weren't fungible at all. In some cases, they even said of your 50,000, you have to spend 5,000 on irrigation equipment, 7,000 on, something else. And I also think that one of the effects of this is a massive secondary market. So people did benefit, but not nearly as much as was intended. Secondly, it's a bureaucratic process, which means, like in Ste's case, the support came 5 months later, by which time his business had suffered structural long-term damage. It's also arbitrary relationship between needs and support, and the whole process is not transparent at all. I think that firstly, this idea of government setting thresholds of who is eligible is problematic, and that idea of a minimum income threshold is basically an anti-poor device. Forms were complicated. Yes, it's better using cell phones. But I think that generally this prescriptive approach that tells you what you can get and where from is problematic. One of the effects, of course, is an expanding market for GM seed, because all of these companies only supply certain types of output. So I think that the structural implications of this, and it's a big, I'm sticking my neck out here on the basis of fieldwork in one province, but certainly in parts of the food system, the big winners were the big corporates who dominate this input supply industry. So I think that, yes, mentoring, listening to farmers is all very important, but the structure of the market is what really matters to people. And I think the effect is that public money has gone into shoring up the power of particular corporates. So I think that also, before thinking about the future, input supply support is not the only thing that people are wanting. In many cases, the problem was the loss of the market. And yet the only support, and that was an immediately felt problem, and yet 6 months later, you get input support, which was not the problem, and it's not resolving it. So I think that we need to think of alternatives. Transport subsidies are important, guaranteed markets, providing general infrastructure. And these are things that are not specific to COVID or a time of acute crisis. These are generally applicable lessons. But I think that the sharp edge of this debate is whether or not this kind of approach should be done better, quicker, at better scale, or in fact, whether it's the wrong approach. So I'd love to hear some debate about that. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth, for sharing your inputs there. I think I'm just wrapping up because we've come up to the end of our webinar. Since we'll be asking questions, we'll be taking the questions that are being asked on the chat box. But before we just go there, I just want to highlight some of the things that are coming up. Yeah, I think it's one of the things is like the concerns around the capacity for civil societies around the work that they had to do in support of the government vouchers and other supports that they're trying to give to the small-scale farmers. There's also a call for more work in terms of government reaching further to these communities and engaging them prior the support that they wish to support them with. And I think in terms of what can be done differently, it's being identified in this platform that there needs to be advocacy strategies which will support communities in a holistic, or rather should I say, in a sustainable manner. It shouldn't be focused on one support for one farmer. It should vary because there are different farmers with different support requirements, and therefore government should speak to that. I think that is what's coming out more in this conversation. More sustainable, holistic approach by government, and more engagement prior to the support that they offer for the communities. Thank you so much to our speakers. Let's head on to the question and answers now. We have a few questions on the chat. So there's one which is from Ayanda Madala. It's directed to you, Ste. So Ayanda Madala just shares, thanks, Tembiso, for sharing your experience and challenges and overall inputs around government support. She's excited that you're a youth who's participating in agriculture. And she shares that it's clear that government continues to use a top-down approach when implementing these relief programs. Do you have anything to share to that, Stay?
Hello, hello everyone again. Thanks a lot, Ayanda. All I can say is, since the government has supported me, it helped me a lot. But right now, I'm still struggling because of the demand of the eggs is high, and I'm not fit enough to supply and all my customers that I have. But I'm really hoping that the government will also do again and support to help us as a small scale farmers. Thanks a lot.
Stay. There's another question by Ben Cousins. Can I pose that to you, Ruth Hall?
And always answers this, asks this question. Well, he asks and answers it. But I mean, one of the implications, so it is fascinating that there's this small scale farmer program. Now, there are different definitions of a small scale farmer, and for some, it's about the size of land or about the turnover of the business, in other words, financially, or it's about the extent to which they're producing for markets or buying inputs. Or hiring labor. These are all different indicators of how small or commercial. And of course, you can be small scale commercial, as Tembiso is fully small scale commercial, or you can be small scale less commercial, more producing for one's own needs and into local communities. One of the indicators just of this diversity is that this 50,000, which was, many people didn't get 50,000. It's not clear exactly how the decisions were made. Some were getting 15, 20, 25, but a lot were getting towards the top end of that spectrum. Now, 50,000 for a farmer at the top end of what's called a small scale farmer of 1 million, that would be the equivalent of 5% of turnover. Government is giving you inputs to the value of 5%. For a farmer at the bottom end of 20,000 Rand, which was the bottom end to start with, that would mean 250% of turnover being supplied. So it is entirely arbitrary. There's an enormous arbitrariness to this. And as I said, there's a particular gender dynamic here, particularly because women were applying more because they had to show that they were part of a registered legal entity. They would often apply as a group, as their cooperative, because as individuals, they didn't have the bank records, they didn't have their individual companies. So, I mean, it's quite interesting even to see here, Stembiso and Portia, so a lot of young men who were producing at small scale for markets, those were mostly the people who benefited, followed by older women who were typically getting less money each, but also each one was representing a whole group. So the gender bias and the class bias was even greater than it appears if one looks at the individual vouchers. So I think that these are some of the very significant issues around the design. And I think nobody will say that government was wrong to try and support people, but we're here to really understand how the type of support and the kind of assumptions that informed that support reflect misplaced ideas about the food system. And I think that the two dynamics that resulted is partly a relocalization of food systems as groups of small-scale producers felt it's too risky to produce commercial crops for faraway markets because they were sending produce to Johannesburg and then they weren't sold. There was enormous food wastage. And then they were in debt to the transport companies. So a lot of risk is associated with this pattern of commercialization and of reliance on bought inputs and production of commercial crops for faraway markets. This is the model that we are promoting primarily through our land reform and agricultural support programs. And I think that it's put people in very vulnerable positions. And our question here should be, how can the approach to crisis lead to greater resilience and equity in the food system in the future?
Thank you so much, Ruth, for your response. I see there's another question, which is for Ste by Nkanyiso Kumedo.
Yes. Nkanyiso Kumete, my My focus or my major customers are the communities and local tuck shops that are owned by the Pakistan. I won't lie to you, Nganyi, so those people are supportive to us as small-scale farmers because what they do, they buy in bulk if they need eggs. And as a small-scale farmer, I'm not fit enough to supply them. And I'm using a public transport, using a taxi to deliver my eggs for them. And here in Pietermaritzburg, where I'm staying in Pietermaritzburg town, I know a lot of them, but they need in bulk, and I'm not fit enough. And they always told me, Tembiso, if you have enough eggs, just put the expiry date and everything. We'll come to your farm and buy. That's all. And only to find out that I don't have eggs at all. I just sell what I have, and only to find out on the time we are talking. The commercial farmers like top laying eggs, they came here right now and give them about 50 to 60 bucks of 15,000. They said, Tembiso, here's your money, but you don't have it, so bye. Then I was heartbroken, but I really wish to get help because I have a market, but I'm not fit enough to support them. They are here to help me to buy my stock, but I don't have too much layers. So I'm hoping that one day the government will help me so that it will be easy for me to create more jobs opportunities in my communities because you know, South Africa is a developing country. So right now as we speak, we are facing population growth, you know, and job creation. There is no jobs in South Africa, so that makes agriculture is a lucrative business in this time. Yeah, that's all I can say. And Nkanyiso, to cover this shortly, the people that I'm supplying, they do affected during the COVID-19 because their shops were closed and automatically their products they are selling was out of stock. So when the Mr. President decided to open the country, they have to throw them away, their stock, all of them, and back up themselves since the government doesn't support them, you know, but they do make means, but it's hard and it's really hard. So it's really hard, but I'm hoping that one day I'll be able to be a big farmer as a commercial farmer and employ more people and feed the nation. Thanks a lot.
In that
Hello.
response. I think we also have another question for, it's from Neil Utli. It's for Ruth.
Do you have access to the balance sheets for the large agricultural trading companies that would be able to analyze how these handouts were used? So I think that's going to be our next port of call. And I think that we need to be asking national government to explain how much went to which of the big agribusiness companies and how those decisions were made. We do know that it was a R1 billion fund. We know that much less than that was ultimately disbursed. But we do need to know, this is a matter of public interest. It's incredible to me that we have so much oversight and controls to ensure that poor people don't get a little bit, you know, like an extra COVID social relief of distress grant. But when the government is handing out hundreds of millions of rands, this is outside public scrutiny. There seems a very distorted set of ideas about accountability for the allocation of public money into the private sphere. So I think that, we will be looking into that. And I think that there may be two tracks beyond this webinar. And the one is asking for information with which to hold the state to account for how it designed and implemented this program, and particularly the extent of private sector capture and benefit, but also some very constructive engagement about what needs to be done, what's been learned, and not just waiting for the next crisis. I think that the kind of listening that people are calling for, but also listening not just to the problems, but to thinking beyond this paradigm that government can wait 5-6 months while people basically have to sell off their stock and end up selling off layers for meat. These are crises from which people don't easily recover. So 50,000 Rand 6 months later is not the same as 50,000 Rand in April 2020. And we need to think of a different paradigm that can be more responsive, whether in times of crisis or not.
Ruth, for that response. There's another question that I'd like to pose to Portia, because I know she hasn't had an opportunity to share. So it's from Dylan Atkinson, farming Gogo, feeding her nuclear family, future in these conversations. May you please respond to that, Portia, or anyone else who can.
Okay, I can jump in, Samke, and I hope Portia can join in to follow on from me. I think from my experience, where the Gogos and the women feeding their families were best catered for was actually in the Solidarity Fund process, where community members, certainly from the civil society groups that were contracted to do some of the beneficiary selection, have very close contacts with vulnerable households. And because the criteria for that was majority women, 70% women, and without, we managed to widen the criteria. Initially, it was just going to be for vegetables. And we managed to widen that so that chicken and other things could be included, so that those women and men feeding their families could be supported. Although 2,000 Rand voucher doesn't go that far, but the smaller the production, obviously, the further it goes. And at least with Solidarity Fund, there wasn't a restriction on what that woman could buy. And there also was a system in which civil society and community members could register input suppliers closer to them who could supply what they needed. So this, again, came from civil society advocacy, but it made a very big difference to communities who could then say, no, this is the input supplier I want. They supply the agroecological inputs that I want for my kind of farming and the kind of chickens that I want, not what government says I should have. So I think that made a big difference. And I know we're very nearly out of time. So a last word, if I may, in terms of the comment made by Nhlanhla Ndoweni around the bureaucracies that tie government up, which we really need to acknowledge, which is why, as Ruth said, the need for ongoing engagement rather than crisis engagement, I think, is critical. And the Minister has stated her support and worked with us on trying to set up a multi-stakeholder platform where we can have those engagements and try counter those bureaucracies. So, yeah, I think that's a very important way forward. Thank you.
There was a question that has taken it forward, and I think you'll have another opportunity, since there are other 3 more questions that I'd like you guys to answer before we close off in the next 2 minutes. So the first one, it's from Ben Cousins again. So Ben Cousins is just stating that if government does not understand the needs of different kinds of farmers, then support programs would be badly designed and ineffective. Does this seems to be the case here, but are NGOs any better? So can Laurel please respond to that, or even Ruth respond to that?
I can jump in. Ruth, do you want to? I'm happy to respond. Or maybe one of the farmers themselves would like to. Okay.
I definitely.
Yes, yes. It would be lovely to also have the inputs as well.
Yeah.
So can I just get your ideas around this? Portia and Stay, what do you think about this?
I think it's crucial for government to take on a different approach where they are going to ensure that they listen. And not only that, inclusion of different communities. For instance, once we got into farming and looking at markets, I was very surprised that throughout the value chain, the involvement of women within it, women are like they kept to a smaller spaces. They lack in a lot of information. I think it would be really great if government makes sure that we have, as Laurel is saying, ongoing engagement. I can give you an example with the organization that I'm working within now. We began as an organization that spends most of our our timing and project and finances on supported motherhood. But COVID came and it flipped the script on us, and we saw that we need to get into the economics of food. We need to ensure that communities are able to stand on their own and they're able to be part of the agricultural sector. It's important to have their listening ear opened all the time.
Thank you so much. We already over by 1 minute. It's been a very interesting platform. It's been a very fruitful conversation. Thank you all for joining us. And please, we just want to remind you that we have our next webinar, which will be on the 29th of April. It's on Mozambique land policy. Please stay tuned for more information around that, so you can also participate on it as well. Thank you all to my speakers. You are very wonderful, and thank you for that fruitful conversation that you brought into this platform. Thank you. Maybe one word from each, and then we can close. Thank you. Ruth, you're saying no. Can you start with you, Stay?
Hello, Sanjay. What you saying, sir?
Yeah, it's just one word to close up. Yes.
All I can say is the time I left my chicken roam around, I think I helped them because some of my hens were able to socialize, and some of them they're making families. So I said I'm gonna put them back on the cages. Okay, bye.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been amazing. Thanks.